Hello, this is Verathane.
And Delphina, we're here with a little note to let you know that the newest Spider Forest webcomic collective anthology has launched on Kickstarter.
Threads Creatures is a collection of 19 brand new short comics, including one by me,
And one by me.
all themed around the premise of creatures.
The stories are all standalone and they run the whole range from comedic to serious, featuring everything from cats and wolves to Victorian lizards and space lobsters.
The campaign will run until April 8th. Go to spiderforest.com/Kickstarter if you'd like to support it.
Thank you very much and enjoy the episode.
Just do it! Don't let your dreams be dreams. Yesterday said tomorrow. So just do it! Make your dreams untrue!
Hello and welcome to Screen Tones, where we talk anything and everything webcomics. Today we're going to be talking about balancing plot, exposition, and characters. I'm Crispy, my pronouns are she, they, and I work on Ghost Junk Sickness.
My name is Delphina, my pronouns are she, her, and I make the comic Zombulus.
I am Claire, also known as Clam. My pronouns are she, her. I work on the webcomic Phantomarine.
I'm Verathane, my pronouns are she, they, and I work on the comics Chiralt and Witchwood.
All right. So, your comic has some cool world building lore that ties into your plot and your characters in some fun ways, and you're really excited to show it off to all of your readers. But how do you explain these things without putting everything else in the story on hold? How do you use prologues? How do you explain all these creation myths about gods and mortals? And how do you also set up custom jargon? How do you avoid scaring readers away with a big ol' info dump? So let's get into all the different techniques that you can use. Let's start out actually by talking about things that we've done in our own stories where we thought we handled it well or handled it poorly. What are some specific moments or concepts in your comics where you think things went well or not? And let's start with Crispy.
Oh, goodness. Well, good exposition is always so satisfying to see in stories, and it's very imperative to kind of, sink in and find something that really works to feel like you're in something that you actually believe in. So some of the things that we kind of have as a rule for Ghost Junk Sickness is to kind of keep those exposition shots and doing backgrounds when we introduce a place is kind of key, especially when we have like a world that's made up science fiction fantasy that doesn't exist in Earthland. We really play a lot with showing the background details, and even doing these little blurbs of exactly where the characters are, and even doing these little boxes, blurby blurbs, to describe ships and stuff like that we have, so that it does actually stick with the readers. And it actually is really fun when you see them kind of like refer to like the things that you have talked about in the past, them getting to understand and know the basic geography of your world really well. So that's really exciting to see. One of the things that I like to focus on a lot is making maps. I love making maps. And I kind of like to map out exactly where the characters are kind of going in this world that we've made up. It helps me as a writer understand, where they are and how to make sense of exactly where and how they got there, as well as like, because I know that, it's easier for me to put it in naturally into the story, as opposed to, I don't know, maybe a scene change and I have to do this long, like, so they've landed in this place and now this place is this and blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't have to over explain it. It's just, they're there because of the artistic cues that we have and stuff like that. And yeah, I kind of like to do it a lot visually because it's a comic.
I'm very envious of your use of captions. just as kind of a tool, like to be able to put things in visually. It's something that sometimes it can be hard to find a way to deliver information very directly and clearly to the reader. Like, here's this character's name, age, their job, like
Yeah.
little basic things that they're not going to approach another character and tell them, because it's a strange thing to do to somebody. I don't walk around introducing myself that way, but you want the reader to know it. And it's just direct, gets it out of the way right away. Convenient.
Yeah, and I think it's just
I'm envious.
like I think it's knowing like the aesthetic of your work that you can do that, cuz like, you know, it's not obviously going to fit in everybody's comics to do like Ghost Junk's little box blurbs of certain characters and certain things and stuff like that. It just doesn't work for everything, but it was just one really kind of fun way that we were kind of more inspired by like video games, and we're just like, okay, we kind of want this like old, I don't know, a little bit of aesthetic in there. And it does kind of get that out of the way so that you don't have to have the page of being like, hello, my name is this, blah blah blah. Especially like with how Ghost Junk is started in the beginning, where you're kind of just thrown right into the action, and it's gonna feel like you're taking the readers out of it if they're chasing the bounty and then all of a sudden all the characters stop and they're like, by the way, Von Gavitt, who is from this place, and your favorite thing is this. What are you doing over there?
Yes.
But see, like, I would probably, like, have them, like, when they're going to, like, turn in the bounty and they have to, like, submit their information or something, like, you could have them fill out a form or something like that. If that style of, because I do like the captions, but if that style doesn't work for you, a lot of times there's, like, paperwork or
Hmm.
a computer display or some kind of, like, profile that somebody might be pulling up to look at this person. Like, there's a lot of ways you can be creative about it.
Yeah, and Trigger's or like actual name is Alphonse, and it's actually said, I think, in chapter 2 when they're going through the checkpoint to go on their way to Farlasukal, and it's not actually said like in dialogue until chapter 4 when Bogmouth is just like, you know, I hope you choke kind of thing. And it's just kind of interesting to throw those little details there, but it wasn't as obvious, I guess, as a detail as it could have been because readers didn't catch that. So I was just like, interesting, interesting.
So yeah, Somnambulist is a fantasy story, and I do have a lot of unique concepts and jargon. I really try to get most of the world building details out naturally in the course of the story, if possible. And I'm actually more than a little okay if people are confused. I mean, sometimes you really do need a page of like, this is who the god is, this is how magic works, this is how the war went down. But I think what gets people is that you don't typically need it at the beginning. You need to establish your characters and their normal first.
Hmm.
And that'll actually get a lot out of the way so that by the time people know and like your characters, then you can start dropping in these things and like, oh my gosh, this has so many more implications than it would have if I had done it at the very beginning.
Like kind of have like something for them to kind of work up towards. And like you said, like basically care about that detail. Cause I feel like it's not like it's a taboo, I don't want to say, to kind of like give this information blankly like that. But there's got to be a way that it's woven into the story so that there is a weight to the words being said, almost like it needs an action and whatnot when you kind of talk about the world building, I guess, essentially that way.
Yeah, I mean, and I actually do have a scene where the character explains how the gods made the world, and it's 9 chapters in. It's like 900 pages in, and it's possibly one of my favorite things because it's coming from like a sales pitch of kind of a snake oil salesman character. And he's very animatedly and trying to sell somebody merchandise based on the gods and stuff. And and so that's like another thing, just having an interesting viewpoint character to bring it to you. It can kind of do double duty in terms of understanding both the world and a character better.
Yes. Yeah, you are doing double duty because of how they're actually talking about it. And there's nothing more jarring than a character like taking details and breaking character describing it. You're just like, oh gosh, like, you know, this one part with this really important world building idea, whatever tidbit that needs to have some kind of, you know, groundwork laid hasn't been laid. and now I'm just going to have this one random character break character and explain it to somebody who already knows so that the audience knows, and it's just that's sloppy.
Yeah, it's really important that like when you're delivering information that it feels like that information is motivated in some way by either the characters or the plot, because
Mhm.
ultimately those are the things that the readers care about more. So if you can give the information that you're delivering, like why does the reader need to care about it? Like the easiest way to do that is like, well, this character cares about it a lot and it's like foundational to like their personality in some way or to their goals, like what it is that they want out of the storyline. Like if it can be connected to that in any way, it can do a lot to make the reader interested as well.
Yeah. And it's basically what goes into what makes naturalistic storytelling so that, it is like properly blended into the works. Like, when something key is being explained about the world, like it has to make sense with the person who's talking about it too. It just or you're instantly going to be taken right out.
And the person who's listening too, if they're speaking to somebody else, like
Yes.
if they're it should be somebody who like doesn't know this information in a believable way. Like they're not going to tell their family history to like their parents or something.
Well, I was just gonna say too, if you show a teacher giving a lecture to a bored student, like
Yeah.
that kind of transfers over to your audience too, because you're telling them to be bored.
Mhm.
And this guy on the street corner everyone's ignoring, like you're telling them this guy doesn't matter, whatever he's saying doesn't matter. And it's just, I mean, sometimes it's cool, but sometimes it doesn't work out. So just try to be careful with that.
I know that for me, one thing that I wanted to avoid, like the plague, was using a kid character as like the exposition dump, essentially, or at least the dumping ground for all of this information. Like, I have a kid, but he's like a part of the world. He's lived in this world since he was born. He's 10 years old. Like, he knows how things work. So it's not something where he's being subjected to like, gosh golly gee, like what's happening here? Like he still experiences the plot and has lots of questions about it, but he still knows, this world has certain rules regarding it. He has a certain place in this world as a result. Like I wanted very specifically to have some of the storytelling told through him and his interactions with his mom. Like they're just going about their day, they're going to a festival, they're seeing certain things about, how is transportation in this world, what is the power source of this world, what is, what's the currency. Like there's all these little things that you learn about the world passively through them just kind of exploring, doing their thing, talking to each other, like talking about, everyday activities or news. Like there's so many different ways that I wanted to convey it, where, this is not using a child character as, a tool necessarily. It works in a lot of cases, but I think for me I was just like, no, he knows what's going on here for the most part, but that doesn't mean that he can't convey all of that as well. Like
Mhm.
you can do it in a way that feels natural. And I do know that, because of the nature of me, trying to scrunch things up so much in the beginning, I did have a couple people say like, wow, they're dropping a lot of information that I know is important. And I'm just like, yeah, I'm sorry. Like I know that I'm probably giving too many world building things all at once, but at the same time it's peppered in between, these two characters just being themselves and talking to each other and, saying, don't go out there, it's scary, sort of thing, but why is it scary, etc., etc. So I feel like I did some things that worked well, some things that didn't. It actually was interesting where my whole first chapter, like I have two characters just talking to each other. You can kind of tell that they're underwater, but you don't know why, and you don't really know anything about the world outside of it. So adding a prologue actually really, really helped a lot of people figure out, okay, this is where they are. This is kind of the rough, not time period, but like inspiration of the time period. Like I've got, big sailing ships, but I also have a character that's wearing like a baseball t-shirt. So there's going to be a little bit of, I guess, yeah, some time shifting there that I wanted people to pick up on and say, oh, there's going to be a mix here. But also to establish like you've got these things in the water that want to eat you, and you don't really get that message until well into chapter 2 originally, and I was like, I don't know if I want to, wait that long. So
Mhm.
it's good to have, pepper your world building in kind of liberally at first so that you can kind of get the basic functions of the world. What are the rules? What's the danger element? Why are people the way that they are here? And then you can go into smaller things a little bit later on. So yeah, I feel like I kind of ran both sides of that, and now I feel more comfortable balancing it as I go forward because there's still some world left to build, and I'm just like, how do I do this both naturally and clearly?
I really like what you said about the danger element because what a society fears can tell you so much,
Mhm.
especially if it's
Mhm.
different from what a normal Earth person would fear.
Yeah. Yeah, like what you did in the toaster chapter with the pigeon, where it's just like, why why does this world fear the pigeon? And it's great. I love how you explained all of that.
Because
It
they're running on toast, man. Pigeon can smell it. They can smell their fear.
but it's just like Clam was saying, it was the way that the information was delivered, like through these conversations that are, it's really imperative when you have that. It's not like, you have this kind of wall of text, I suppose, stapled or pasted to some other wall in the story where the characters have to read to understand things. It's just finding certain little bits to be like, okay, how do we get the audience to understand what this means to the world that we're reading in? I think is really key with that.
I think it helps to honestly like look at the way that you talk during the day. Like if somebody were just eavesdropping on your own conversation, what could they learn about the world that you live in? Like talking about like, oh, this new thing just went on sale, or oh, this war is happening over here, or all sorts of different things, like
Hmm.
just coming through the news. Like there's a lot of different ways to convey it, and you just talking with people can tell other people a lot about, where you're from, what your deal is, what you care about. So I would say, yeah, pay attention to how you talk and see if you can make your characters do the same thing.
Yeah, it's definitely very important to work information in. If you're using dialogue to communicate information, it's super important that it's conveyed in a way that sounds like a real person might actually say it. And that
Yes.
whole like, character voice, it should be more important that you're keeping them in character. You can find other ways to deliver information. Like in some cases you might not even need to deliver it through dialogue. You can introduce it in background art and stuff like that, which might be a much more natural way to smooth in that sort of detail. As per the question, it's funny, Clam, that you were mentioning a child using a child character as a crutch to deliver things, because I kind of did that in my first webcomic.
It's okay. It's legit. It's
I was
okay.
just like sweating, like it was me.
No, if it makes sense, if they don't know certain things, like absolutely use any kind of character for that.
Well, she was in that specific case, it was like exposition on easy mode, because I had this child who was like immediately taken completely out of her element. Like she was a city kid, her city got destroyed, now she's wandering in the forest where she's never been before, and then she gets shrunk to be super tiny, and now everybody's got to kind of help her find a way to get back to normal. And just her personality was very inquisitive and very like gregarious and social. So every scene that she was in, it was like I had this perfect vessel to kind of bring the most out of all the other characters around her. It was a lot of fun to write. Like I had a ton of fun with her. I don't necessarily feel like it was a bad thing, but I had a learning curve when I finished Geralt and I started my next webcomic, Witchwood, because the cast in that story is much older, and they all presumably, at least in the beginning of the story, they kind of have an understanding of all the important things about the way the world that they live in works. It opens in the city that they live in, and they're familiar with all the major like factions and stuff like that. So it got a bit harder to find clear ways to communicate in dialogue some of the important things about this fictional world that I had made up. There were some things that I think I did a better job at communicating than others. Like one kind of fundamental thing that I needed the reader to understand fairly quickly is the concept of casters, because I have a magic system where the way humans utilize this funky magic spell system is through a piece of technology that they wear on their hand. And if you take the caster off, they can't use magic anymore. So I made sure to kind of set that up fairly quickly. Like by the beginning of chapter 2, like I showed a character like removing one. It was a whole thing. And then I was like, okay, I've nailed this one down for the most part. It's a straightforward enough concept to get. But there is something else in a way that is even more like foundational to the way the world works, which is the premise that like the world got invaded by aliens a little more than 20 years before the story started, and like it's changed a lot of things fundamentally about the way society has to work and like the types of animals that are around and stuff like that. But that's something that was almost so basic and fundamental to the world that it was really hard to find a place to like state it outright in the story, like talking about the timeline of like when the invasion happened and stuff like that. Like the cast of characters that I was following didn't really have a convincing reason to need to tell each other about it. And in some cases, this is the kind of thing that maybe I could use like caption boxes to do, or like go to a scene in a mission control room with a different set of characters or something like that. But I stubbornly tried to stick it out as long as I could without like doing that sort of thing. And I feel like I got to the point of being in like chapter 5 or something like that. And I was like, it's been like over 200 pages and I still have not like specifically communicated this in text. So I ended up going back and adding a couple of pages to the very beginning of the story that just kind of panned around, like showed a little bit more about what the city that the story starts in, like what it looks like at this point, like showing that it's kind of ruined, but there's little bits of society that are like people trading with each other and like slowly rebuilding in the ruins, just to kind of get that out of the way, because the plot that I had set up in that first arc, it was not giving me very many opportunities to like illustrate that, so I had to find little ways around it. Speaking of that, this goes pretty well into the next question, which is how do you make sure your exposition doesn't stall the story's flow and isn't boring? Delphina?
Oh gosh. I mean, there's so much opportunity for it too, because when you're doing a fantasy series and you're doing an epic thing, I've got like two different magic systems and three different like races of magical beings and stuff, and it would be very easy to make it very boring. So I just try to be creative with it. I try to keep the pages in Zombulus where the only activity is exposition to like a max of 2 pages. Because even with the most interesting window dressing, it's still a lot of material that the audience isn't always going to retain. So, and I do try to make things do double duty. So, like, I have a backstory where one person is seeing the other person's childhood memories, and you are learning about what happened, but you're also seeing it through the eyes of someone very opinionated, someone who it is new information, and you're getting some character moments in along with the backstory. A lot of other things I use visuals to infuse the mood of the narrative, because you can just do a pretty splashy image with text on it, but the times I've tried that are honestly much more forgettable than the ones where I made things in a deliberately goofy or suspenseful art style. One thing that I did in Somnambulus was flock tract scene, which kind of parodied the infamous religious chick tract comics. So I used the same art style, I used all of that, and I had like this page of exposition in this tongue-in-cheek method of art. And so it was subconsciously showing that Sydney's sources of education on why these people were evil had an extreme bias. They came with some degree of zealous fervor, but I was able to put that in with the art and not necessarily, and that kind of enhanced it, I think. So think about ways that you can do that. Another thing that's really important to me is that how you say the thing is almost more important than what you're saying. Because you can have a tragic backstory or something like that. And I mean, we've heard every permutation of the tragic backstory before. Oh, I was banded as a kid or whatever, but the way that people feel about it is going to be what really nails it. And I do this to comedic effect and also sad effect. So comedic, like I did a trivia night scene. It came after turning point for the paladin, who is at this point desperate for credible information about how she's magically stuck to these other people. And she's really willing to go to ridiculous lengths to get answers from literally anybody. So she hops up on stage and starts saying, I'm having a trivia night. You are going to answer all my questions. You'll get 100 points per answer. Ready, go. And so all these people think they're answering a trivia night question when they're really just giving exposition and fun stuff like that. But it's also done in a way that it means one thing to her and it means something else to the people she's asking. And I think sometimes also just Q&A comics are really cool. They're a nice little way to take a break from the plot and let your reader ask about what they want to know, because that'll point out the holes that you didn't like fill in for them properly. So I do that, and I also try to see if my characters can answer them creatively, again, to kind of infuse the information I'm dumping with character moments. And there's actually a lot of details that I didn't even have before I did a Q&A comic about it. I just kind of tease them out of myself when I'm trying to make up an answer for, like, why doesn't any other coffee place exist besides Wingbucks? There was an answer for that, and it turned out to be like really cool when I thought about it. But they're just fun places where you can dump some info without interrupting the plot and also just give yourself a little more break. I have a lot of fun with that.
It was one of the really cool things that I miss about Tumblr being more active was having those asks kind of open where people would ask you about the characters and stuff like that. And I felt like
Yes.
we developed a lot about that. We actually came up with a chapter because of an ask asking about one of the seediest kind of places in all of Ghost Junk. And I was just like, oh yeah, let's do this. And we're like, oh wait, this is fun. And then, more came from it. So I agree. They're really, really fun to kind of explore.
That's so good. I think the only thing to kind of watch out for when it comes to those character asks things is that, especially if you plan to like put things together in print later on, unless you include those in the print volumes, some section of your readers won't see them necessarily. So if there's information that goes into one of them and it becomes foundational to the plot in some
Mhm.
way, whether it's because it's really cool or like it's just something that you meant to get to, like if it's in a Q&A, that like referencing it later in the story without including the information itself might end up confusing people a little. So like if you do something cool in a Q&A, just make sure that you also find a way to seed it in the story proper.
Yeah, yeah, definitely include it so that, like Thane said, it's not whiplash and you're like, wait, what? Why did this happen?
I mean, if it's a little thing and it's like a tiny in joke, like an Easter egg or something, like ha, this is a reference to my December 3rd Q&A from 2017 or something.
Oh my god, but what if it's like, you know how they have like the asterisks beside like the box and then the
Oh,
very bottom of the page? It was
See issue 365.
oh no.
no, don't do that. Well, I mean, you can though. You can like cross-link things. If we're specifically just talking in the context of a webcomic and you don't care about printing it or something like that, we have links at the bottom of pages. You can totally utilize that.
This is true.
This is true, but I'm also a lazy reader. I'm gonna admit that, like right here. When I'm like in the zone, at least this is how I'm reading. I shouldn't say lazy reader. I'm like I'm in there and I don't want to look at anything. Like I don't look at the comments. I don't look at anything else. I'm like I'm on the page and I got to see what happens next. Like the comments are going to spoil it for me if I go down too far. Like I'm in this and I don't know. I guess like clicking on a different link will take me out. I don't know. Maybe I'm specific.
No, I mean, that's entirely fair. And I definitely wouldn't use like auxiliary art to explain very important key things.
Yeah.
I think, but they can tell you, like, if a person is asking this, it means at least one person is curious about this
Mhm.
thing. And maybe in an editing pass, when you're going back, you'll find an opportunity to talk about that, like in canon.
Mhm. Oh gosh, nothing's worse than like something happening in your story and you have people confused but instead of putting it in the story, you have a series dedicated to having that information laid out so that they also have to look and read this other thing while reading the
Mm-hmm.
story. That's a lot of work to put on someone who's reading your story.
There used to be kind of a wave of this sort of thing happening in webcomics where very important information about the cast and about the world would be literally just in the cast page instead of in
Oh.
the comic itself. I don't think this tends to happen so much nowadays, and maybe it's partly the influence of places like Webtoon and Tapas where you don't have a cast page on the comic, so you kind of have to put everything in there. But like there are some older comics from back in the day where like the cast page had an essay about every character, and if you read the essays you'd be like, wow, I had no idea.
No.
Like, this isn't in the story. That's
Oh.
cool, but
I would have liked to see that. And that's honestly, that's something scary that I wouldn't want to hear a reader say is I would have liked to have seen that actually in the story though. I'm like, I failed there. Important stuff, not, you know.
I think actually one of the ways to do it really nicely as like a balance is actually what Ghost Junk does, which I actually I've started thinking more and more like I really like the idea of you do present information in the story that is clear, you understand what's going on, you understand, political, I guess, balances and certain parts of the world that are not familiar in terms of our own kind of earth atmosphere, but you clarify it in these really nice extra little world building pages at the end of every chapter, and you also make a kind of a spectacle of it. Like, you put together a whole art project regarding it, and it clarifies things in a certain way similar to the blurbs that you give for certain characters, like popping up on screen so that you can refer back to that information in a more condensed format. It's still there in the actual text, like it's just kind of highlighted in a really cool way in an extra couple pages here and there. I really like that. I've always thought, if you do include it with your books, which you do, I think that just adds to the experience.
It actually is a part of a character, and I will say nothing else.
Oh my. Well, I like the sound of that.
you tease.
What?
But
See, that's
yeah.
how you do it.
Yeah. I always think of like when delivering information, I don't know, it always has to be motivated. Even with those extra notes that we have at the end of each book, there is going to be something about them that wraps up at the very end of the story that is making sense as to why they were presented in that kind of information or that way. But I always think like, there has to be a purpose to everything, and not like something that breaks your brain when you're thinking of this purpose to give the information with, but it does still have to make sense and be presented in a way that readers still care about it. And I think it's a hard balance for that because there is a lot of information, especially when you're making something, completely from scratch, and it's a whole world from your brains, and you got to cover a lot of details that maybe aren't, they don't have an earth equivalent, but it's just kind of understanding that information to like its fullest extent as a writer. And you don't have to explain every single detail giving it to the readers, but just like the gang said, artistic ways with the backgrounds or like objects or, dialogue, little moments. There's way to pepper it in.
Yeah. I think of it as a braid a lot of times where I have
Mm.
like a couple different strands in one chapter, and I take the thing that I want to tell you, and I take the thing that's happening in the plot and I twist it, and like I do like 8 pages of this and then 8 pages of that and then alternate back to this and alternate back to that, and they kind of support each other. You can kind of tie in a theme there in terms of, drawing them together so you see how the past might inform the future, or how this character doing this thing right now informs what this other character is doing and how they're similar or different.
I also use that sort of thing to reinforce certain lies that I've told in the story. Like, interesting things, I guess, because I've started adding a couple of those, those lore pages at the end of my chapters just to, highlight certain bits, consolidate certain bits of information, but also I do kind of write them in the voice of somebody who's in this world who believes these lies. And anybody who's reading them can tell, like, oh yeah, there's something wrong here. Like, this is not the way history went. They just don't know why yet, but it's something where I can kind of reinforce that information, bring kind of a mystique around it, but also highlight, like, this is the way that the world views this bit of information. And, if I were to write it from my own perspective, it would be something where I'm telling you everything. I'm telling you completely unbiased viewpoint of what happened. And that's not fun. Like, why not, if you are going to add a little bit of that kind of, I guess, ancillary information, whether in, kind of mini pages or little, blurbs here and there, make it interesting. See if there's a twist to it where somebody will read it and then reread it and go, oh, you fiend, you.
Yeah, one of my favorite scenes too is I have someone who had a big fight with another character, but they're having to report about it later to their superiors and they're trying to play it down as much as possible. So I could have just shown the fight, I could have just shown everything that happened like at the time it was happening, but instead I chose to show, okay, here she is, she's giving this report, and the dialogue that she is saying is just very politic and like, there was an altercation, there was a small incident where the parties voiced their concerns, but the visuals of the comic were actually showing this like big powerful battle and it's just like the dissonance between that and her lies were very that was just such a rewarding and fun scene for both me and the readers to just show the character of this is what she's trying to do, she's trying to behave, but this is what actually happened.
It was so good.
I actually really, really love that in comics, that the ability to kind of go back and forth with the visuals and telling those things, those lies, like you and Clam said. I think that's absolutely, it was such a good moment. Like, ah.
Well, like unreliable narrators and like bits of history that like everybody believes in that are actually fake or just stuff like that. They're so good and so juicy because there's so many opportunities for it to say something about the people involved or about the world itself. And unpacking that can make such a fascinating plot. I feel like there's just something very, I don't know, compelling, I guess, about introducing stuff like that. Maybe because in real life it's common for people to have conflicting viewpoints. Like if you ask two people about an incident that happened 10 years ago, they might tell you very different stories and they might not even think that they have a different opinion, but just, memory works in funny ways. So I think it's cool when stories do that.
I also think it gives you an out if you're not 100% committed to something. It's like, well, maybe they weren't always, they didn't know the whole story. Yeah, that's the ticket. I do that a lot.
I do that too. Partially because there's certain elements that I have not figured out yet where I know the basics, I know most of it, but there are a couple things where I'm just like, I don't want to give too much because I am still trying to figure it out myself, readers. I'm sorry. I
Yeah.
think yeah, it's nice to have kind of that flexibility built in where you have this sense of like, you're telling a lie, but the vagueness is part of it as well. So, is it because people don't have enough information to know what's true and what's not? Is it because somebody's told a lie very specifically? Like, there's so many different ways you can do that. And yeah, that's something I actually didn't think about going into an exposition episode. Like, how do you make fake
Yeah.
exposition? I think you have to highlight it early on so people are not like, you lied to us. But it's something where if you kind of introduce that feeling of like, something's weird here, I want to read more, like that can be a crucial part of your exposition. Like, here's the lore and the world and the gods and blah blah blah, but you, discerning reader, Do you feel something weird about this?
Mhm.
Let's talk about that.
Mhm.
When it comes to stuff that's been said outright by a character in basically any of my stories for the beginning of it, there's like a pretty solid chance that it's a lie. Just and I mean, part of it is like Delphina said, like working a little bit of weasel room, like somebody can say this thing, but it's just a character saying it. Like, why do they believe that? Does somebody benefit by
Mhm.
either individuals or like a whole society kind of sharing this belief that things are a certain way? Like, is that the truth? Who spread that? Like, for enough people to believe something, like, there can be reasons behind it, and it's fun showing them.
Lots of onions there. So many
Many
onions.
onions.
Like, I think that's what exposition is, just a lot of onion layers. There's so many different ways to kind of tackle this. And I feel like asking the question first, you kind of go with your obvious answer of just, well, it was said in an info dump, or I can use a backstory to kind of explain things. But I think, like, peeling said onion, you're definitely going to find a lot of different ways to kind of, you know, go at that and kind of delve into it. So I did want to ask y'all, do you have any advice for other creators about balancing exposition with the plot?
I think one of the points that Delphina made also very earlier in the episode is just about getting scenes to do double duty.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you have a big chunk of information that you need to deliver, start to break that down into its component pieces. Like, if it's a legend, or if it's like just a fact about how part of your magic system works, or the geography of your land or something. There's different pieces to it, and you don't need to communicate all of it at the same time. And some of it can show up in different ways. Like, some parts of it, maybe you only need a visual, like just have it in the background of a shot at some point. Some of it you might need a character to say out loud to another character. But if you look at the scenes that you have coming up in your story, you can find opportunities among that planned plot line of yours where maybe you can work in just a little bit into the dialogue in one of those scenes that illuminates one element of your big world building concept. And then a different element goes into the next scene after that, and so on, like wherever it seems appropriate.
Yeah, I think of them as pockets. Like, find your little pockets where you can little sneak a little thing in there, and you won't necessarily know exactly how much you can fit in until like maybe the end of the chapter or something like that. So that's where working ahead can really help for you, because if you have the whole chapter in front of you either in script form, or you have enough buffer where you have those pages that you can like look at it from beginning to end, then maybe you can go back and reinforce things, or look for opportunities where like, I didn't have the time I thought I would to really explore this, but maybe if I add a panel here, or maybe if I jam it in there. There's a lot that you can do if you have an editing process and you have a drafting process from the get-go. So I would really recommend trying to set something up for yourself around that.
I think another useful thing when it comes to exposition and like balancing it with making sure your story like doesn't grind to a halt when it's being delivered is to find a point of view to deliver it from.
Yes.
Like, because sometimes a specific character will have like more of a relationship or a connection to this world building concept of yours. And if you can use them to either explain it or to like demonstrate it in some way, it can really help to connect it. Because like another thing that was mentioned earlier, it's like how it's delivered can be really important. So if it's attached to a certain tone or an emotion, and it can really kind of tint it with a feeling that will make it even stronger, and the reader will be A, more likely to remember it, which is useful, and B, they'll just care about it because the story's made them care.
I always think of, like, I'm going to repeat what I said previously in the episode and say that my number one kind of piece of advice would definitely be the motivated deliveries of these things, which is basically encompassing everything that y'all have been saying. It's just, if this piece of information has to be explained in the story dialogue, like who is talking, like Thane said, have like a point of where this is going to be delivered, and why are they talking, like why are these characters, why now, who wants to hear this. And I think thinking about, as a reader, who wants to hear this is probably a very, very important kind of question to ask yourself, because if it's at a point where it's just just like, does the reader at this point need to hear this or want to hear this now? Like, am I going too early? Am I going too late? Like, kind of understanding like where and when and why this should actually be present in the story actually will help deliver with that impact that's going to happen if you do have some rather large thing explained or revealed.
I know for me, when I think about a couple different things that I did, I guess with the prologue that I added, as well as any exposition I did kind of after this initial, scene between these main characters, like I think about it both as like, people talk about the pyramid of needs, where you've got a foundation where it's like, okay, what are the most important things that I need to know about this world to understand it? And that was kind of what I solved with a exposition in a prologue, because I didn't have any of that initially, and that was very important information to have before going into the rest of these interactions with characters. I think you still have to pepper in character moments in that kind of establishment of that foundation. And I think, as long as you kind of find this rhythm where, one bit of information dropped, two character moments, two bits of information dropped, one character moment. Like you have a trade off so that it doesn't feel like, an endless supply of like, remember this, remember this, remember this. Like in the prologue that I did, I wanted to establish like you've got things in the water, they're driven away by light. That's a very important thing. And then when the light goes away, then bad things come out to play. Like those were three very important things that I wanted to establish right from the get-go that I didn't establish until well into the future. It still came, but I feel like having that earlier on is important. The other kind of concept that I think about in terms of, it's a common kind of phrase in game development, but the vertical slice, where you want to establish kind of the mood of the world, the foundations of what it's going to be like going in. You don't have to spill everything initially, but you do need to establish some things very, very quickly, or else the audience is going to be like, wait, go back to that. Why? Like, what's going on here? So everybody's going to have a different thing with that. But I think for me, it is always important. Like you do have to convey information. You can't avoid that. I think there are some comics where I think they hold too much back. They actually don't make it clear enough, and then you are relying on kind of reading between the lines of what these characters say, when sometimes as a reader, like there's so much to go through, I really would actually want something a little bit clearer. I know I've been worried sometimes about making things too clear, but I think that it's not bad. Like your audience will thank you earlier on if they can kind of say, okay, I understand this is why this character is this way, this is why this world element behaves the way it does. Like, you've got my interest, I understand the basics, tell me more. And I think it's hard to start out with, just characters in a scene just talking, which is what I did, and expect people to be like, all right, I'm on board with just this. But if you show the major elements of the world as much as you can early on, I think that's very important. So don't be afraid to be a little too obvious sometimes, maybe.
You're absolutely right, Claire, because I think of like stories that hold too much information back and it's an absolute detriment to the entirety of the story, no matter how beautiful it looks, no matter how fun the characters seem to be. When information is held back and a moment happens or passes that you didn't understand because the information wasn't presented to get it kind of feels like a ball drop, definitely. And, your interest is definitely going to start to wane, especially if it's supposed to be this big revealing moment. And, it's kind of a letdown being like, oh, wow, this was really subtle. What happened? Who?
And it's a different experience between something happening and you're like, oh wait, what did like what happened here, and then feeling happy about going back and
Mm-hmm.
rereading, versus feeling like, oh gosh, I need to go back and study. Like,
Yes.
you're not really going back and experiencing the story. You're going back and hunting for information that you should honestly have, if it's a big enough thing. Like, there are some
Mhm.
tiny things that I've put in that people have not picked up on yet, and I know as soon as they go back they'll be like, oh darn it, I could have seen this. but that's foreshadowing. That's a whole other sort of thing. So it's just, yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't rely on foreshadowing to like give exposition to your story if you're a reader or sorry, a writer who does that. It's honestly it's too subtle. There are people who are very very passionate who will be like time to dissect this work, but to expect that of all your readers is a little it's a lot.
And I think that's where the character interactions come in. Like I know everybody's different. Some people they go into a world and they get more sucked into the world than the characters.
Mhm.
Like they want to write a wiki about it. That sort of thing. And that's very commendable for a lot of worlds, but I think for a lot of readers it's like you want to know what's going on in the context of the characters navigating this environment and this kind of this society. Like
Mhm.
you want to know why they're going through this journey and what's kind of on the horizon for them or what might be coming for them from behind. Like it's just you want to understand the characters in the context of the world, and I think
Yes.
you want to make that very clear as much as you can.
Yeah. And that's the thing that I always say is that you, as the writer, will know everything. You hold all the cards. And sometimes when you think that you're being obvious, it might not be actually obvious enough. And, it's a really fine line to balance, especially if you want that impact for your readers to, get like, what the heck? And, oh, I'm very excited. Just, having those great reactions in that comment section and just kind of losing it. And, if you didn't give that information properly or effectively, it could feel like poop.
I think too that's where you need beta readers, just like
Yes.
being able to have somebody's eyeballs that are not yours, somebody's brain that is not inside your brain to say like I'm confused by this or this didn't seem to play into anything that I just read. So why did I have
Mhm.
this information in the first place? Cuz you can over explain for sure. And you don't want to do that, but you also don't want to under explain.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like the balance between those is very tricky sometimes, and sometimes the only person who can tell you is a reader at,
Mhm.
either at the beta level, preferably before you're going live with your
Live.
page. But
Yeah.
but commenters might say something, and my view is always that webcomics are the most editable medium that we have. If you want
Yes.
to change a page, you can change what a page says and you can re-upload it. And I know like Thane with Witchwood has done that a couple times just to make sure that they're reinforcing the points that came later,
Mhm.
that were important.
The 2 pages that I added to the very beginning of the story, part of why I did that was actually because over the course of the first year or so of the comic being out and updating, I was kind of noticing, like, nobody was talking about this specifically, but I had the feeling that commenters were kind of misinterpreting the vibe
Mhm.
of part of the world. It wasn't a specific thing, like, it didn't seem like it had been confusing or anything, it's just that, like, there wasn't enough for people to go on about what this actual fictional place is like. So I decided to add content after the fact to illuminate that a little bit more. Even if I still didn't get very like particular about it. There's no dialogue on either of the pages. It's just kind of like panning camera shots around the city. But I feel like it was very important for like setting the stage of the
Yeah.
story to open with that information.
Yeah. I find that it was such a beautiful addition. I felt like reading those pages when you put them in, I felt like I was gently lowered into the land of Witchwood and like instantly pulled in.
Excellent.
It was just the two. It was just 2 pages that you did and they're gorgeous and it was just like this is what the world is about. All right, let's go. And same with you, Clam, adding those pages to the prologue. It was just like, you know, like you could still get it without it, but I felt again I was gently lowered into the sea and, just kind of enjoying seeing what, where they are and getting the vibe. I think the vibe is very, very important for that.
And your readers just get more.
Yeah.
Like it's never a bad thing in the eyes of many readers to just be like, "Oh, 2 more pages? Heck yeah, give it to me." Like I want to see more of this world and these characters. Like sometimes it can be a little bit too much, but I think if you find a way to add a little bit more or a reason to, yeah, don't hesitate. People will eat that up.
Om nom 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 nom. It's
Ooh.
Nom
me.
nom nom
I'm
nom.
eating it up.
Oh my god. That sounds like something I would eat also. Like,
Like a chicken Caesar wrap?
Oh,
my God.
how perfect is that?
Maybe we should enjoy
Delicious.
our chicken Caesar wrap or our Thai crunch wrap, depending on what flavor you want.
That does sound like a chicken salad Caesar Thai crunch wrap.
With extra cheese.
My favorite.
Oh, that definitely wraps it up today. Thank you so much for listening. I've been your Crisp, and you can check my work at www.ghostjunksickness.com.
I've been Delphina. You can find my work Somnambulous at somnambulous.com.
I have been a clam and a half. You can find my work at phantomarine.com.
I have been and will continue to be Verathane, and you can find my work at chiralt.sevensmith.net or at witchwoodcomic.com.
Gosh.
I'm glad you're persisting, Thane.
Somebody's got to do it.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to Screen Tones. Please subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to also follow us on Twitter at ScreenTonesCast.